We've brought with us a 3/4 of an inch scale model of the Mayflower and are enjoying sharing that here at the Colonial Heritage Foundation's Colonial Festival. The Mayflower, of course, was instrumental in American history because one of the founding written documents of American history was the Mayflower Compact, which was signed aboard the ship after it arrived in Massachusetts after the long voyage of 66 days over the Atlantic Ocean in a stormy condition. When you're on board ship, the captain's in charge, but when you get off the ship, no one would have been in charge, and the Pilgrims realized that. So they decided that they needed some sort of an agreement or a compact to allow us to be able to get off the ship and not just have a chaotic event. And so we formed a group that sat down and wrote an agreement that we all had to sign in order to get off the ship. So the first element of that was that we were still British citizens. We came aboard a British merchant vessel. And the second part, we wanted to be able to pursue our religious beliefs the way we wanted to practice them. So you were free to practice your religious beliefs however. And then a third element to this agreement was that we had to write some rules under which we were going to live as we came ashore. And then the fourth thing, which is the real important part, is we had to agree to abide by those rules. So in the back, we have a copy of the original wording of the Mayflower Compact. It's up on the wall of our display over there. But what they basically did was create a document where the concept of we the people was the governance. No dictator, nobody in charge said this is how we're going to do it. A group of people who were going to be citizens of this colony formed the rules, and we agreed to abide by those rules. So the significance in American history, predating the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, is we the people are going to behave this way. The model, built by a professional model maker, was commissioned about 2006 to teach American history. And so we take these into classrooms and show this. I, as the first mate, Robert Coppin, aboard the ship, and our Susanna White, who is 10th descendant passengers, descendant of a Mayflower passenger, tells the story from the perspective of a passenger and a person experiencing the voyage. I talk about it from the position of being a shipwright, how the ship sails, what makes it work, where do you go to the bathroom, what's the bell for, all the pumps, all the different kinds of technical things about a ship from the 1620s. This was a commercial. This was the 18-wheeler. This hauled cargo all over the North Sea and into the Mediterranean. It traded British woolen goods for Spanish wine and Portuguese wine. And we know that because the ports of call from these various countries have record of this ship trading wine and British goods. And so we know a lot about the Mayflower, both from British historical records, because we know when she returned to England, she was sold, and so we know the inventory of her. And we have William Bradford, the first governor of Massachusetts' colony, sharing with us the daily life of those who had made the journey. And so these two historic documents collaborate then, and we know way more about the Mayflower than we do any of the other ships that brought pilgrims to the what would become the United States, but to the various colonies, to the Maryland colony, Virginia colony, and others. And then the exciting thing for me is to be able to teach history through several forms of your senses. So we pass around this prickly rope, and kids can feel what a cable or a rope is like to handle. This in scale model is this line right here, and this line right here is representative in scale of this line. So you can see the actual size of something. And then the kids can find these parts in the rigging, way up in the top, and the dead eyes that are down here, right here. Okay, so this is how big it is. How heavy is that? Kind of surprisingly light. Well, we don't want big rocks attached to our rigging flying around, so they're actually made of a very light wood, a pine or a spruce or something like that.
It would especially be bad if the lines broke and if they were heavy and the lines broke.
Well, if the lines break, what do we got to do? We got to learn to tie a knot, right? Okay, so the sailors had to know where all the lines went, the names of all the rigging, all the different pieces. And the Mayflower is a very simple rig. It only actually had 5 driving square sails. A topmast over here carried an upper sail above the mainsail, and then on the foremast it had the foresail and the top foresail, and then it had a jib, a square sail way up front. If you were to look at a clipper ship, for example, something like this, we're talking about 33 sails. Now, imagine a line that supports the end of the boom or the spar, the lines that brail up the sails, the lines that pull the sail in and out from the top, the lines that pull the sail in and out from the bottom corners. Multiply that by 33, and that's a rough number of how many lines are on this. Miles and miles of rigging. The sailors had to know knots, ropes, names of everything, which is the appropriate one, which one's a cable and which one's a rope and which one is stronger. Well, you'd look at this and say, okay, this is a real bigger one, so it's stronger. But in fact, this is a 3-strand rope. This is a 4-strand cable. There's far more fibers in this smaller, tighter bundle. So we use this for high-strength things like the anchor line and for some of the standing riggings. This was more of a general purpose rope. So although they look similar and this one's bigger, it's actually much weaker. So the sailors had to learn that, and this is the Starship Enterprise of 1620. This was the latest technology that we had at the time. This is how we got from point A to point B, and how we traded goods was in a merchant vessel like this. And it just so happened the Pilgrims hired or rented this boat to take them to the North American continent. And had they not hired this particular vessel, we wouldn't have known much about its history. It would have faded off into just being another commercial vessel, been broken up years later after its useful life of some 20 years was over. She was about 11 when she made the crossing. Okay.
And so once the Mayflower arrived in the New World, the colonies, then what happened?
Well, she arrived not in any colony. The problem was she had an agreement to go to Virginia colony from the Virginia Company, who had advertised for them to come there. So they had made a contractual arrangement, and so they were headed that way. But because of issues with the Speedwell, the other vessel traveling with her, and had to return several times, they didn't leave until September. What's going on in the weather in the North Atlantic in September? Starts with an H, ends with an E. It's a hurricane season, okay? And so we don't have the luxury of a nice calm voyage. We have 66 days, miserable days at sea. We are crossing the North Atlantic and heavy winds and high waves and all of that. We did not have the triangular foresail, which allowed us to point towards the wind, as in this example over here, with the triangular shaped sails ahead of the forward mast, which helps to direct the air behind the other sails. But rather we have a sail that can only catch wind, like a big sail, like a kite or a parachute. It can only catch the air coming in it. So it couldn't, the vessel could not go towards the wind. So being further and further blown up the east coast, pushed by the Bermuda current as well, stormy seas, past New Amsterdam, past New York, ends up off the coast of Massachusetts in November, okay, in bad winds and ice and just miserable conditions. Well, we had plans to plant a crop in Virginia in May, in June, July, and we have all the seeds. Well, now they're worthless, okay? So we're short of food. We've been at sea way longer. The trip was miserable. People were ill. Oh, here's a question. We started out with 102 passengers. We ended up with 102 passengers. How many people died?
Well, I know a number died due to the.
But one was born.
And one,
A young, yes.
Okay.
So we had one. So we had one die, one born on the trip. His name was Oceanus, if you want to know. But anyway, yeah. So that's just one of those trivia, kind of interesting little side things about the whole voyage and the founding of our country. You know, as it relates to the trip of the Mayflower.
The cables on the ropes. What material were those made from?
It's all natural fiber, mostly made out of manila more currently, but any fibrous plant would do that. And jute is another one that was typically used. Hemp was probably the most popular waterproof woody stemmed plant that the fibers could be peeled from, and it was available in longer lengths. So making up the rope out of hemp was much more common in 1620.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions?
With the ship itself, once they landed in Plymouth and everybody got off, what happened to the ship? Was it?
Okay, back up a little bit. They didn't all get off because there was nothing ashore for them to live in. It's November.
Right.
Most of them stayed in the Hotel Mayflower, okay, and overwintered aboard ship. They would take trips in the shallop, which the little boat is still inside this boat because we haven't taken it out, but it's in there. But the shallop took people ashore, and they started scouting for where they were going to build homes, build cabins, and that sort of thing. And that process got started over the winter, and later much more in earnest into the springtime. But by April or so, the captain and what was left of his crew, half of them had died also because of starvation. So 15 guys sailed this back to England, and that was kind of an amazing feat all by itself. But he was also then critically ill and took sick and died. And so being a quarter share owner of the vessel had to be sold to pay the bills. So we have British records of the receivership, the courts, selling the Mayflower and her contents to pay the bills. And she was broken up then, I think, 1623, something like that. A couple of years later, she had laid at anchor there. Things had started to rot. Nobody was caring for her, so they took her ashore and broke her up. In Harwich, England, there is a barn called the Mayflower Barn, and they believe that some of the timbers from the original ship were used to build the barn. The time period is about right, and of course it makes a great tourist story, so we don't know the real authenticity of that story, but that is what is told. So parts of her may still be around. Yeah, cool. Lots of things we point out on the Mayflower, of course the rigging and all that sort of thing. The way that she's moves through the water, through the push of the sails and all that. And then we have other display items. For example, what direction are we going? Well, we use the compass. What time is it? We use the hourglass. The crew had to turn all the time. And then we have a storyboard here. This is what told the crew, the next crew coming on duty, what direction we were going and what time it was that we were going that direction. So we have time and we have direction. Now we need speed, and so we would go to something called a chip log, and that is demonstrated over here by the guy with a big reel and a chip of a piece of wood. He would throw that overboard and count the number of seconds that it took for the knots on the string to pass through his hand. So the term knots, in terms of reference of speed through the water, is now applied to our modern day vessels. So you'll see knots in miles per hour. And that's a nautical mile, not a statute mile. So there's a few variances there. But we now have speed through the water, we have direction, we have time. And between all of that, you can then plot on a chart where you think you are. And that's called dead reckoning. It's putting all of some variables together, and we think this is where we are. Okay.
Interesting.
When did the Mayflower head back to England?
In the spring, April of 1621, it returned back to England. It took about a month, as it was recorded. Much better.
Much quicker.
But better were more favorable trade winds coming across the North Atlantic, much better weather, and so she arrived there. But the captain fell ill.
He died before she got home?
No, he passed away at home with his wife and family. I want to say months later, but that may not be correct. One of the issues that we find in tracking down historical documents is that even things like calendars, which we take for granted, different political bodies and the church have used different calendars. Different religions use different calendars. And so when we talk about arriving on November 7th, well, that might be according to one person's or one group's calendaring, but not everybody agrees on those exact dates.
Sure.
So,
Wow.
interesting things you find in history.